the glow of a flickering oil lamp just before dawn cracked its knuckles across the horizon, women of the 1800s were already upright, corseted, calloused, and quite often completely over it. Their job descriptions were less domestic goddess and more human Swiss army knife. And while they may not have had smart watches or coffee pods, they did wield brooms like sabers and stirred porridge with the quiet rage of someone who knew they'd be stirring it again tomorrow, and the day after, for possibly the rest of their natural lives. Let's take a quiet stroll back to an ordinary kitchen in, say, 1837. The air is thick with smoke from the hearth, which is both stove and central heating. You can practically hear the faint groan of the wooden floorboards, each one whispering oof under the weight of expectations placed on women during this era. The woman of the house, often referred to simply as mother, was up well before the roosters finished their warm-ups. She began her day by lighting the fire, which was not as easy as striking a match. There were no matches, not yet in common use. Instead, she used flint and steel, probably muttering something polite yet vaguely threatening under her breath, because heaven forbid the fire not catch. Without it, there would be no boiling water, no breakfast, no warm anything, just a chilly, judgmental morning. Breakfast wasn't scrambled eggs and lightly toasted sourdough from a 12-speed toaster. No, it was most likely mush, porridge, maybe enhanced with yesterday's milk if it hadn't spoiled into a soft complaint of its former self. Women consumed barely a portion of this, as most of it went to their husbands, children, farmhands, and quite possibly that one goat that always showed up when food was being served. After breakfast, the real fun began. Laundry by hand. Now, you might think laundry is a nuisance in the modern world, but in the 1800s it was a muscular, splash-heavy event akin to arm wrestling your family's entire wardrobe. It involved emptying giant wooden tubs, filling them with water heated over a fire, and using soap that was homemade, because convenience stores, tragically, did not yet exist. Can you imagine scrubbing trousers with lye soap while a toddler tries to eat pond gravel behind you? Welcome to Tuesday. And yet, amidst these constant labors, many women found quiet joys. They embroidered. They sang softly, often to themselves, while shelling beans or churning vast buckets of butter. They told each other stories while rinsing clothes in the river, the kind of gossip that may or may not have invented the concept of reality television. And they created little rituals, like tea in the late afternoon, not because the Queen said so, but because it was the only pause in a day that had no breaks. Mothers often trained their daughters early to assist. Tiny apron-clad assistants toddling next to spinning wheels and washboards. These girls learned how to preserve jam, thread needles through impossibly small buttonholes, and remove stains caused by mysterious male endeavors. A woman's strength in the 1800s wasn't only measured by her upper body capacity to churn cream, but in her logistical genius. Who else could cook stew, educate 5 children, and repress thousands of emotions while also managing to sew an entire summer wardrobe out of flour sacks? To survive such endless labor, women developed physical resilience, but perhaps more impressively, mental resourcefulness. They used whatever they had: animal fats for candles, old bones for broths, and gossip as both currency and entertainment. Humor was subversive, often sly and mumbled just low enough not to drift past the ears of visiting pastors or gossipy neighbors. Imagine this: a woman stirring soup, murmuring to her friend about how Mrs. Alder's pies are as hollow as her sermons, while both stifle giggles and pretend to concentrate on dumplings. Resilience came in many forms: a pocket flask, a secret stash of licorice root, a moment of eye contact with another tired woman across the market square, one that said, "Yes, the baby threw up on me again, and no, I will not be fixing my hair today." And somehow, they found their way through it, each day rolling into the next like slightly overcooked biscuits, crumbly, a little dry, but still holding together. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, close your eyes if you haven't already. The fire is crackling low. The porridge pot is finally empty, and soft footsteps move toward the candle-lit parlor where other stories gently wait in the quiet. It begins with a broom, or something vaguely broom-shaped, often wildly uneven, with bristles that like to quit halfway through a sweep. In the early 1800s, cleaning the home was less a daily task, more a lifelong commitment. Imagine being locked in a duel against dustballs the size of hedgehogs while armed with handcrafted equipment, a stubborn attitude, and the kind of determination usually reserved for Arctic explorers. Floors weren't just dusty, they were expressive. They told stories: spills from dinner, ash from the fireplace, a footprint made by boots that had walked in from 4 muddy seasons. Hardwood floors were rarely polished and never quiet. Each creak served as a polite reminder that ghosts, or at the very least nosy mice, might be listening. Women, often the designated commanders of household order, rose before sunlight dressed in long skirts and woolen shawls, heavy enough to count as small furniture. They lit fires, stirred porridge, and immediately began combat with the previous day's grime. It's worth noting that ventilation was more of a rumor than a reality. One open window, and the entire house would conspire to freeze solid. So, chores were often accompanied by the gentle scent of damp socks, cabbage steam, and whatever soot had recently settled in the corners. Cleaning in the 19th century was not so much product-driven as elbow grease-fueled. For laundry, women hauled water by the bucket, each a shoulder workout of Olympic proportions. Boiling water on the stove wasn't just for tea. It was the first step in a grueling cycle involving homemade lye soap, washboards that doubled as medieval torture devices, and the never-ending surprise of finding yet another child's sock lodged in the hearth. Stains weren't stains. They were personality. Multicolored blotches on shirts and petticoats reflected a family's culinary choices, gardening enthusiasm, and capacity for tipping over ink. Then there was the ironing, or more accurately, the arm-wrestling match against wrinkle-prone linen. Irons, simple hunks of cast iron heated on the stove, retained their heat for approximately 12 seconds before cooling into useless hand weights. Women rotated between multiple irons in perpetual synchrony, creating an unintentional choreography that involved burning fingertips, singeing hems, and occasionally questioning everything. Yet, within this whirlwind of labor, there were rhythms, comfortable in their predictability, almost meditative in their repetition. Contentment was found in the gentle hum of work, the hiss of the kettle, the clink of dishes in the basin. Children lent a hand, and by lent, I do mean they ran outdoors the moment they smelled soap. Cleaning supplies of the era were both impressively creative and slightly alarming. For example, boiling bones for glue was perfectly normal. Housewives developed cleaning concoctions from vinegar, ashes, beeswax, and whatever herbs hadn't yet been claimed by the family goat. Windows, when washed, which was rarely, received a curious cocktail of stale beer and newspaper, a combination surprisingly effective and weirdly festive. In homes lucky enough to afford domestic servants, the workload shifted rather than disappeared. Maids rose absurdly early, 4 o'clock was considered fashionable, and tackled each room with the enthusiasm of someone promised hot soup at the end of it. They learned how to walk on floorboards without squeaking, how to fold laundry like origami, and how to breathe quietly around large pieces of Victorian furniture that looked like they might come to life. Still, at the center of it all was this curious blend of struggle and skill, a kind of low-tech ballet. A woman handling the hearth knew her way around hot coals, cooking pots, and the fine art of poking things with a stick until they surrendered. The house was both battlefield and sanctuary, governed by routines older than grandma's elbow liniment. Perhaps the most impressive feat was how seamlessly women of the time folded exhaustion into normalcy. With red hands and soot-marked sleeves, they coaxed order from chaos while humming lullabies handed down like family secrets. And under all that effort was something steady, a quiet pride. Not because they wanted applause, but because the pancake griddle was finally clean, and that, friends, was victory. As the days rolled into evenings and candles flickered low, the work did not stop so much as fade gently into the hush of night. Yet still, in the corners sat the brooms, the pails, and the irons, like sleepy sentinels waiting for tomorrow's return. And while the work within the worn-out walls never fully disappeared, so too did the resilience of its quiet heroines never falter. Now, let us follow the flickering amber of the kitchen lamp, where an iron pot simmers and something delicious, if a bit mysterious, is beginning to boil. In the early to mid-1800s, mornings in a typical household did not begin with birdsong and a luxurious stretch beneath 800 thread count Egyptian cotton. No, they began with the scrape of fire pokers, the clatter of iron grates, and the hopeful prayer that one's fingers wouldn't freeze clean off before breakfast. For women across rural and urban households alike, the day was not gently ushered in. It arrived like a muddy boot through the front door. Because before porridge could be boiled or a shred of sunlight dared breach the curtains, the hearth had to be reawakened. You see, central heating wouldn't become common until the 20th century. And back in the 1800s, every home relied on fireplaces and cast-iron stoves. These weren't the charming aesthetic features we now adore in Pinterest-worthy cabins. They were either blazing infernos threatening to devour half the wallpaper, or recalcitrant lumps of iron requiring an emotional pep talk before they'd warm the room. So it often fell upon the woman of the house, or more precisely, the woman in the house, since few had the luxury of staff, to rekindle the fire before dawn. Fingers numbed by cold and thick with ash, she would shovel in coal or wood, fan the embers, and pray the smoke chose to go up the chimney this time instead of flooding the kitchen like a moody ghost who'd failed to find peace. Once the fire was finally coaxed into performance, the next order of business was, of course, water. Hot water was a fantasy, and indoor plumbing was still considered a madman's dream in many areas. Fetching water meant hauling a clunky iron or wooden bucket to the well, the pump, or, in less fortunate homes without even those luxuries, an icy stream. The bucket, by itself, weighed roughly as much as your second cousin Todd, and the water inside only added insult to near injury. With aching arms and skirts dampened by sloshes of frigid water, she would return indoors victorious, if not exactly limber. Now, with a flicker of warmth from the hearth and water standing by like a surly soldier, she could begin the process delightfully known as scouring. this was not a light wipe down. It was an all-out domestic siege against soot, grease, and various unidentifiable stains that had developed intelligence over the winter. Floors were scrubbed on hands and knees with lye soap that could dissolve moral ambiguity, and rugs were beaten outdoors with a vigour that would startle modern sensibilities. The kitchen was a particularly treacherous battleground. The cast iron stove, oh, that majestic metal beast, was both a source of nourishment and daily combat. Cooking on it was a matter of guesswork, learned instinct, and likely a minor pact with the household spirits. There were no knobs to turn, no digital displays. Heat was uneven, temperamental, and liable to burn your biscuits while whispering false promises about the roast. And as if one stove weren't oppressive enough, laundry day came like a fresh insult to civility. Without electricity or washing machines, the process went as follows. Boil water until it screams. Melt in lye soap until the cauldron resembles something from a witch's picnic, and then invoke your triceps to scrub garments on a washboard. This activity was mostly conducted outdoors or in unheated outbuildings, which the climate regarded as an invitation to snow directly onto your bloomers. And we haven't even reached the ironing. The sad iron, named so perhaps because its existence made everyone feel a little less optimistic about the future, weighed roughly 6 to 8 pounds. It had to be heated directly on the stove, and since it cooled quickly, a woman might rotate 2 or 3 irons during the process, chasing fleeting moments of heat like a pilgrim seeking epiphany on a schedule. Despite all this, there was a rhythm, a rough poetry to the labour. Women, strong, clever, and astonishingly adaptable, devised little efficiencies. They greased irons with beeswax, pre-treated stains with saved lard, wrapped sore joints in flannel, and sang while working to keep their minds lively and their spirits tricked into cheerfulness. Work was hard, but resilience had a sort of lace-edged dignity to it. As twilight returned and candles were lit, a luxury if tallow was scarce, there might be a moment of rest, perhaps by the now steadily crackling fire, perhaps with a bit of stitching or reading aloud in a soft voice. A fleeting silence where the house, scrubbed to within an inch of its life and heated to almost 1 full human degree above freezing, could finally exhale. And just before that last candle flickered out, before the worn hands were stilled until dawn called again, there might be thoughts of tomorrow's meals, and how the bread, of course, wouldn't knead itself. But that tale, my dear listener, waits in flowery folds yet to rise, somewhere between dawn and the rooster giving up on everyone being impressed by his punctuality. Women of the 1800s were already up, not because they were morning people, mind you, but because the alternative was discovering what happened when you ignored bacon fat, sitting out in the hearth for too long, a smell so vivid it could knock out a Victorian ghost. The day began with kindling a fire, an act far more complicated than lighting a scented candle and declaring yourself an herbalist. No, this fire was the apex of domestic science, requiring dried wood, a steady hand, and a dash of prayer. If you were very lucky, the coals from the night before still smouldered beneath a quilt of ash, but more often than not, it meant crouching in a floor-length skirt with a bundle of twigs muttering, oh please, just catch." Water, of course, didn't come when summoned by a chrome handle turning counterclockwise. It had to be dragged in sloshing pails from the well or the pump, if your property was upgraded to 19th century fanciness. A strong breeze could reposition your bonnet, your dignity, and that bucket water all in one swoop. Repeating that journey half a dozen times before breakfast was the norm. Hydration, it seemed, was fought for teeth, laundry, and oatmeal be ever in your favor. Laundry days, usually Mondays, because even suffering likes a schedule, were an Olympic sport. The washing wasn't just about removing dirt. It was, quite frankly, a form of therapy. If your idea of therapy is plunging garments into scalding water with a wooden dolly stick and beating them against a washboard, while the steam reconfigures your curls into clouds of chaos, soap, incidentally, was either handmade with lye and rendered animal fat, or it starred in your nightmares. Making it was a saga of patience and occasionally minor chemical burns. Store-bought soap was a rare luxury, like figs out of season or hearing a man say, "You've done enough housework for today." Oh, and don't forget, clotheslines double as social commentary. Hang your petticoats too close together, and neighbours may whisper of carelessness. Let your bloomers flap too publicly in the breeze, and someone might write a letter to the church, governance board. But leave laundry too long on the line, and the goats might eat it. The 1800s did not censor their weather, nosy townsfolk, or livestock. Mealtime was its own chapter of toil. Kneading bread was upper arm cardio before that was a thing. Dough had to rise by virtue of wild yeast, windowsill warmth, and maternal scowling. If you had children, and statistically, you probably had 6 or 7, you were cooking with one hand while fishing small objects out of toddlers' mouths with the other. Always a multitasking queen. Preserving food for winter was a science involving salt, vinegar, beeswax, and hope. Pickles were not just for sandwich upgrades. They were little jars of victory over decay, meant to carry you and your cellar straight through to spring. Root cellars were packed tighter than a grandmother's church purse. Rows of gleaming jars, shelves of potatoes, and that one terrifying jar of vaguely purple jam no one remembered making. House cleaning was not so much a chore as an eternal Sisyphean trial. Soot from the fireplace found its way onto every surface, including ceilings, somehow. Dusting meant tying rags to wooden poles and swinging them around until either the dust disappeared or you got a splinter and called the day a loss. Floor cleaning involved rugs that had to be taken outside and beaten, not a euphemism, laid across a line and thwacked within an inch of their lives, releasing gusts of ancient crumbs and possibly the ghosts of old sandwiches. For those in more pioneering situations without rugs, that's easy. You just swept the dirt floor of more dirt. Satisfying. Perhaps effective. Not particularly. Needless to say, fashion wasn't formed out of leisure, but out of iron will. Corsets weren't about looking dainty. They were about posture, support, and occasionally hiding cookies in stitched-up linings. The concept of dressing down was waking up and, instead of 8 petticoats, wearing only 5. By the time evening came and the fire was banked low, those same women sat beneath oil lamps or candlelight, mending the very clothes they had washed, dried, and nearly strangled with their own apron strings earlier that day. Yet still, they managed to find joy. In the flicker of a flame, the softness of a well-worn apron, the satisfaction of well-set preserves, and sometimes, as the moon leaned in through crinkled window panes, they would sit on creaking rocking chairs and just breathe. And breathe they would, until it was time to fix the next problem, the mattress, filled with straw that had developed opinions of its own. But that is another tale entirely. When one thinks of domestic labor in the 1800s, it's easy to envision the clatter of wash basins, the hiss of iron stoves, and the oddly menacing thud of a butter churn. But allow your mind to drift a little further inward, to the hands that stirred the stews, scrubbed the floors, and stirred up clever ways to make it all bearable. For in the midst of the rigorous routines, women found pockets of levity, community, and, believe it or not, subtler acts of rebellion that made the mop handle feel a bit lighter. Now mind you, 19th century housework was not merely a set of chores. It was a full-time, multidisciplinary survival strategy. The average woman in, say, 1840s rural Ohio wasn't just sweeping crumbs. She was maintaining the gravitational balance of the universe, or at least her log cabin, with nothing more than lye soap and sheer force of will. Let's drift into one of those timbered cottages, shall we? Picture a small room with a glowing hearth, a heavy iron kettle slightly singing over the flame, and the scent of rising dough weaving through the smoky air. Now, behind the blurry haze with flour in her brows, stands a woman in a homespun dress, rolling biscuit dough with the skill of a surgeon and the stoicism of a Buddhist monk. She's quietly muttering her mental checklist: bake the bread, skim the milk, beat the rug, apologize to the neighbor's pig for yelling at it, again. While men in the mid-1800s often performed the public labors, harvesting, trading, voting if they felt radical, women were the quiet CEOs of the domestic economy. Every stitch of clothing, every slab of soap, every quilt and pickled beet came under their jurisdiction. But here's the delightful twist. Women found curious ways to weave community right into the drudgery. Enter quilting bees. Quilting, objectively speaking, is the art of stabbing fabric repeatedly with a tiny weapon until it's both cozy and socially acceptable. But a quilting bee? That was where Jane from down the road brought her pineapple preserves, and Martha brought unsolicited opinions about everyone's sons, and together a whole gaggle of women turned square patches of cloth and slight passive aggression into heirloom bedding. They also came armed with gossip, news of births, crop failures, and the tale of that one man who tried to fix his own barn and now lives under it. In that context, labor turned into laughter, at least until someone spilled tea on the quilt top and was forever branded, in local law, Sticky Annie. Now, housekeeping didn't only require physical stamina, it demanded a mind like a ledger and the stamina of a mule in church trousers. Women managed inventory without paper, remembered recipes without books, and essentially ran precision time management schedules without the help of clocks. When the rooster crowed, that was your alarm. When the sun hit the floorboards just so, that was lunch. When the children started throwing potatoes at each other, it was probably bedtime. And perhaps the most iconic labor of all, laundry. Oh, sweet innocent word that you are. Laundry in the 1800s meant hauling water, boiling it in a cauldron big enough to frighten a witch, scrubbing clothing with lye soap that could dissolve your patience, then wringing it all out like you were training for a barnyard wrestling league. Rainy days were resented, not because of the gloom, but because delayed laundry meant the terrible fate of Wednesday undergarments, which were stiff, scratchy, and universally feared. To lighten the load, both literal and figurative, many women developed little rituals, singing while milking the cow, telling stories to children while polishing the stove, and when the work allowed it, sitting by candlelight with a bit of mending and the soft click of a needle through cloth, whispering gossip to a neighbor, or pondering whether the kaleidoscope of stars overhead cared at all about how clean one's chamber pot was. Even in solitude, women managed to craft connection, a stitched name in a garment, a floral motif hidden in an otherwise plain dish towel, flourishes of beauty in a life of utility. Generations later, Historians will look at embroidered samplers and see ABCs and pious sayings, but these works offered a quiet rebellion too. I exist, they say between the lines, and I made something more than supper today. And so, with hands worn smooth and arms moonlit by effort, the women of the 1800s wrapped their lives in work that was as demanding as any battlefield, but stitched together by laughter, ritual, and an unspoken alliance with every other woman bent over a broom or a boiling pot. As the fire fades into night's humble cottage and the kettle lets out its final sigh, let's follow the dreamy scent of fresh-baked bread into the next warm corner of history, where even the humble apron had secret meanings stitched into its folds. The kitchen, in the 1800s, was not merely a room for cooking. It was the household's roaring forge of survival, and for women, it was more than the domestic heart of the home. It was a smouldering, soot-covered test of endurance that would make modern boot camps look like spa retreats with optional lemon water. Let's begin with the stove. Today, one might twist a dial or touch a button with the elegance of a distracted violinist. But in the 1800s, lighting the stove involved coaxing a fickle pile of kindling and coal into a flame, a delicate process full of black dust and blistered optimism. If you sneezed at the wrong moment, back to square one. Some women dubbed it the morning wrestle with the iron beast, though few had the time for such poetic reflection when breakfast was already late. And the heat. Dear listener, the stove's warmth was not limited to the pot of porridge bubbling away. No, it wrapped itself around you like a suffocating wool blanket in mid-July. Summer cooking was an act of masochistic devotion. Many a woman finished her day with her hair frizzed by steam, and the altogether charming aroma of boiled root vegetables lodged deep into her clothing. Eau de turnip was never, alas, a Parisian sensation. Water, too, was no friend. There was no faucet to sing under or dial to twist for hot versus cold. Fetching water meant hauling steel or tin buckets from the outdoor pump, or worse, the creek, often multiple times a day. This wasn't cardio. This was the full-body, grip-strengthening, shoulder-blistering activity of a lifetime. And after lugging bucket after bucket in the chill of an early dawn, one could enjoy the occasional satisfaction of discovering a frog had claimed the kitchen basin for itself. Bathing water had to be heated meticulously. Dishes scrubbed with lye soap, a harsh concoction made of animal fat and ash, left hands raw and deserving of a long vacation. Unfortunately, vacations, like rubber gloves or ergonomic dish brushes, had not yet been invented. Domestic manuals from the era, which cleverly disguised themselves as helpful housewifery guides, offered readers the same kind of comfort a dentist offers before picking up the drill. They contained recipes for bread, but also for soap, ink, and homemade glue. Because if you couldn't fix your child's school slate with a bit of flour paste and patience, were you really committed to motherhood? Then there were the marvels of cleaning. Not the speed vacuuming, podcast-accompanied rituals some might know today. No, this was a time when rug beating involved carrying carpets outside, hanging them on a line, and exacting punishment upon them with a purpose-built beater, or frankly, anything large and stick-like. Dust clouds would rise like haunted apparitions of every muddy boot that had graced the parlour since last spring. And let's just take a slow breath in and picture the moment when someone dropped a pan full of stew on the floor. No paper towels, no quick wipes. Just a soup chaos-soaked wood floor that one must lovingly, patiently scrub with homemade vinegar concoctions, knees begging for mercy on cold boards, and a family waiting for round 2 of dinner. Still, amid all this, there was a strange kind of art to it. Needlepoint was picked up in spare minutes, between simmering and scouring. Witty remarks were exchanged between neighbours over laundry lines. Children might find joy in being swung in clean linens or playing with tin cooking moulds shaped like rabbits. And in especially festive moods, a woman might tie on a fresh apron, the period equivalent of daring mascara, to mark a holiday or a visitor. There was, strangely, a kind of rhythm. Tasks followed the cadence of the light. Laundry on Mondays, ironing on Tuesdays, baking on Saturdays, with bread warm from the oven as a reward for whatever indignities the chimney had offered that day. And on Sundays, at last, something soft, the sigh of stillness, broken only by the creak of a chair and the whispering turn of a Bible page. It wasn't glamorous. No one emerged from the 1800s smelling like lavender and dignity. But there was craft, perseverance, and so very much starch. Now, while some tended their hearths and hauled pails, others laboured on in the dimmest corners of the home, the silent sweat lodges of cleanliness known intimately as the washrooms. And as the soap thickened and the wringers clanked, so too did another chapter of womanly endurance unfold. By the dim light of an oil lamp, Gertrude Davenport squinted at a potato. She had spent the better part of her Thursday peeling precisely 146 of them. Perhaps this sounds like an exaggeration. It is not. She had counted. Why, one might ask, did Gertrude need 146 peeled potatoes? Because in the year 1849, she had a family of 8, 3 borderline grin-shaped neighbours who always dropped by coincidentally around dinner time, and 1 mule named Percival who insisted on sticking his snout through the window whenever anything vaguely starchy appeared. Gertrude's life, like the lives of so many women in the 19th century, was dedicated in large part to the act of doing things the hard way. There were no microwaves, certainly no meal kits that arrived in neatly chilled boxes. Just Gertrude, a dull knife, and an unending stack of tubers that looked increasingly like small, poached moons. Meal preparation in the 1800s could start before sunrise and end sometime around next Tuesday. The average woman spent 40 to 50 hours a week cooking alone, not including the time spent gathering firewood, lugging water, plucking chickens, or apologizing to said chickens. Recipes were not the precise photo-guided instructions we know today. More often, they went something like, prepare a pudding the size of your youngest child. Bake in a moderate oven until done, or until your husband arrives home and asks what smells like burning. And oh, the moderate ovens. These were iron beasts that whispered the sweet promise of second-degree burns every time you opened their door. Temperatures were judged by intuition, or by creative methods like tossing in a pinch of flour to see how fast it browned. Culinary witchcraft, really. Baking bread required the time, attention, and spiritual stamina of a monastery. But it wasn't just cooking, it was hauling. All the hauling. Water, wood, milk, laundry, babies, and butter churns the size of small picnic tables. Rural women walked miles each week just to gather water. They did so while pregnant, often while chasing toddlers and yelling, "Don't lick the cartwheel." The human body was essentially a muscle-powered appliance store. Laundry day was a particular kind of medieval. Once a week, if you were ambitious, or had recently been visited by an exceptionally muddy relative, you'd haul kettles of water to a backyard cauldron and boil everything to kingdom come. Soap, too, was homemade, involving ashes and lye and a hopeful attitude. Scrubbing was done on washboards with such enthusiasm that the boards themselves had the right to unionize. Clothes were then wrung out by hand, twisted like angry towels, and carted outside to dry, often in bitter cold. On some days, your underpants froze in midair and became what one neighbor referred to as pantaloon icicles, a haunting sight among the hedgerows. But adversity sometimes breeds genius. Women found ways to ease their labors, little hacks and secrets, quietly passed down like folk songs in the steam of the washtub. For instance, smart girls knew how to soften their dishpan hands with lard. Daughters learning to sew were told to keep their thread between their teeth while they worked. This made it easier to cut lengths, though it probably confused the family dog. Many borrowed ideas from native women and black domestic workers who knew centuries-old methods for using herbs and hot stones in both healing and housekeeping. A poultice made of onion skins could draw out a fever. A bit of vinegar in the dishwater made the plates shine like flat ceramic suns. Ingenuity, you see, was the unsung anthem of household survival. And despite the relentless work, or perhaps because of it, humor flourished like daisies in a manure field. A woman might spend the afternoon kneading bread and muttering under her breath that if her husband brought home one more improved butter churn, she'd churn him. Children would giggle over the sound laundry made on the board, wooba wooba wooba, while the neighbor's goat tried once again to eat everyone's bonnet. The trick was learning to snatch moments of joy between the endless cycles of wash, cook, sweep, repeat, an impromptu dance while stirring jam, a shared cup of lukewarm tea while the baby napped, sneaking a forbidden baked apple before dinner and blaming it on Percival. It was labor, yes, but it was also life. And as the stars blinked open over the soot-swept chimney tops, a modest hush fell over the Davenport's cabin. Gertrude finally sat. Her feet ached. Her hands smelled faintly of onions and flour. But her potato pile was finished. The mule was asleep, and she had managed not to set anything on fire. Tomorrow, she'd do it all again. But first, just first, she'd let herself dream. And as we drift with her into the quiet hum of the prairie night, let us peek next into an unlikely tool of survival. One forged not of iron, but of needle and thread. Let's drift now into the dim and drafty stillness of the 1800s pantry. A cavern of cool stone and secrets, designed to preserve not only perishables, but patience. It was here, amongst shelves sagging under the weight of pickles, preserves, and prudent decisions, that many women retreated during the chaos of the day. Not to rest, of course, this was still the 19th century after all, but to stir, scrub, and stack in relative solitude. The pantry in a well-heeled home was a quiet pocket of domestic dignity. It was partly a larder, partly a laboratory. Row upon row of glass jars, each a miniature terrarium of something vinegary or sugared. Little soldier pears suspended in heavy syrup, cabbage imprisoned in winter brine, cherries brandied to the point of inebriation, and there, among them, a tired woman with a wooden spoon, her curls slightly damp from both the canning steam and the eternity of expectations. Now, preservation wasn't a mere hobby, it was survival in high-necked form. Before refrigeration, winter might as well have worn a skull and crossbones. The harvest had to last until spring's first hopeful sneeze, which meant women turned into culinary time travelers, bottling the sunshine of July cucumbers to outlast February snowdrifts. Canning was both an art and a perilous flirtation with botulism. One false seal and the pickled beets could become lethal grenades by Christmas. So women became not only homemakers, but amateur microbiologists. The mighty mason jar, a 1858 invention by Mr. John Landis Mason, bless his innovating heart, was a game changer. With a twist of the lid and a prayer to St. Preserver, patroness of shelf stability, or she ought to be, the contents inside could be kept safe from the mouldy maw of time. But lest we envision a gentle pioneer lady humming contentedly as she boiled yet another batch of apple chutney, allow me to remind you that these women were also fending off cranky children, singed hems, and the occasional mouse brazenly thumbing its whiskered nose at decency. The pantry became a quiet refuge, not because chores were easier there, but because, unlike the parlour, it didn't require immaculate hair or polite conversation. A woman could mutter to her jars, wear an apron henpecked with flour, and nobody would bat an eyelash. In fact, the only lashes around were probably stored in a little tin somewhere near the pickled pig's feet. And oh, the pride of pantry showmanship. When visitors came, rare and usually smelling faintly of buggy leather or regret, the lady of the house might find a casual reason to open the pantry with theatrical nonchalance. I just need to fetch a bit of horseradish. Pay no mind to this stunning display of 11 dozen jars arranged by colour and defying both gravity and logic. Let's not overlook the spice rack, often little more than a chipped wooden shelf with jars that whispered of a world beyond soot and starch. Nutmeg, cinnamon, clove, fragrances that tugged the mind towards storybooks and sea voyages, even if the closest most Victorian women got to a ship was boiling salt cod their husbands swore wasn't old enough to vote. Some savvy women even recorded their recipes and preservation methods in lovingly tattered household books filled with pressed flowers, spilled ink, and cryptic notations. Use the good vinegar, one might read, alongside Never Trust September Peaches. These cookbooks didn't just preserve food. They preserved womanly wisdom, desperation, and occasionally passive-aggressive notes about Aunt Wilhelmina's jelly scandal of 73. Beyond the pickling and preserving was a quiet feeling of defiance. Women took a practice that ensured survival and transformed it into a gentle kind of alchemy. They bent time just a little. They stole sweetness from seasons already past. In the stillness of the pantry, with hands busy and thoughts drifting, they carved out 5 minutes of control in a world where so little was theirs. And so, as the last of the summer strawberries were tugged down into syrupy deep sleep, and the pantry shelves settled into their silent vigil, these women returned to the glowing hearth and ceaseless chores, their footsteps echoing soft and slow on wooden floors. Soon, we'll follow them through another daily rite of passage, the scrubbing of clothing upon washboards that had all the mercy of medieval tribulation instruments. But for now, let's tuck this jar of ginger pears gently into the back corner, just beyond the pickled oddities and the mystery jam labelled "Do Not Discuss." By the dim, flickering oil lamp of an 1800s kitchen, a woman's daily to-do list unfolded like a choose-your-own-adventure novel. Except you didn't get to choose. An adventure was mostly defined as hauling water until your arms fell off. Let us step, quietly now, into the part of the house where the aromas of soot and soap reign supreme. The world of laundry. Not the kind of laundry you toss into a machine and forget about while watching your 5th episode of a cozy crime drama. No, this was laundry that could break spirits, snap knuckles, and induce lifelong resentment toward uncooperative petticoats. In most households without servants, which by the way was the vast majority, laundry wasn't just a task, it was a weekly war. And that war had a name, Mondays, known throughout much of the English-speaking world as Wash Day. Monday was considered the designated day for transforming textile carnage into something vaguely wearable. Water, that glorious and elusive element, had to be gathered beforehand. If you were unlucky, say living in a prairie homestead or a New England farmhouse without a well in convenient arm's reach, you began by lugging pails of cold water from rivers, springs, or rain barrels. Hydration, yes, but for your linens, not your pores. Next came heating the water over the fire, a process that involved minding a screaming iron kettle the size of a tenacious toddler. The sheer labor of preparing for laundry was enough to reduce the 19th century soul into a softly sweating apparition in a bonnet. When the water was ready and your optimism thoroughly boiled out of you, the clothes would be soaked in a solution that included homemade soap, made, of course, from wood ash and animal fat. Yes, soap was something you could theoretically make after breakfast, if your breakfast didn't involve preparing 14 other things. Once stewing in this mildly caustic stew, the washables were beaten, scrubbed, and wrung out like gossip at an afternoon tea. Clothes were thrashed against washboards until the garments or the washer, whichever gave out first, called for mercy, and wool, precious wool, shrank up in offense the moment it caught a whiff of a boiling pot, no matter how much you cajoled it. Washboard injuries were real and widespread. Knuckles bloomed like raw little forget-me-nots, evidence of a fight with stubborn corsets and mud-streaked bloomers, and one might even sing through it, just to stay sane. Folk tunes met friction burns in harmony, and thus was born the mythical concept of making chores fun, a belief that continues to haunt chore charts and parenting books to this day. And yet, somehow, a camaraderie bloomed in those backbreaking moments. Neighbors often banded together. Women shared tips, stories, and at times, batches of particularly successful soap recipes that might have included secrets like grated beeswax or the tears of 8 disappointed suitors. Laundry was then hung upon lines, pinned like letters in a fluttering paper trail for the local birds to critique. Natural drying was the only drying, and breezes were both a blessing and a liability. Nothing like racing across a clover field to rescue a cotton nightgown from a mischievous gust and a sprightly goat named Milton. Of course, not all women could afford the luxury of a full wash every Monday. Some resorted to spot cleaning, brushing, or what was delicately called airing out, a technique still alive today, frequently practiced by travelers, college students, and anyone who owns more than 2 sweaters they're afraid to launder. In urban areas, laundry became something one might outsource, though the laundresses who took your garments had their own bramble path to tread. Working-class women in crowded cities like London or New York took in wash to scrape by. It paid little, demanded much, and often involved walking heavy baskets across uneven cobblestones with the strength and stamina of a mythological creature. Think Hercules, but with a broken corset and frostbitten fingers. Still, even amidst the froth and steam and general soap-based chaos, there was a sense of pride. Clean linens were not just a necessity, they were a soft badge of diligence and a bulwark against both actual dirt and the social suggestion of disrepute. A spotless collar said, "I may have no vote, no land, and my own ribcage in a vice, but by heavens, my underthings are blindingly pure." And so, the wash was done, the water was poured away, and Tuesday, sweet, sore-handed Tuesday, offered the promise of ironing, mending, and a nice rest, by way of repoaching that same shirt sleeve that mischievous Uncle Edgar spilled gravy on last Sunday. Tomorrow, we step with quiet feet into the next layer of labor, the art and challenge of feeding a household before canned goods refrigeration, or the mercy of takeout menus ever existed. Imagine it's 1867. You've just spent 6 hours doing laundry by hand, boiling linens, scrubbing them against a washboard until your knuckles look like you've tried to give a porcupine a handshake, rinsing them in cold water hauled in by bucket, then wringing them out like you're auditioning for a strongwoman contest. Now picture this. Your youngest child toddles into the open doorway with soot smudged across his nose and a frog in his hand. Another is lamenting that his shirt has disappeared, possibly into the abyss of the privy. Dinner isn't cooked, your corset's chafing in 3 new locations, and you've just remembered that you're also expected to churn butter today. Welcome to leisure in an 1800s household. There was a certain dark poetry to the daily shuffle. Women, particularly those running rural or working class homes, performed more physical labor than most coal miners, except coal miners didn't usually have to breastfeed between shovel loads. Survival wasn't just physical, it was mental. The real trick was not letting the endless parade of chores eat your soul and serve it with boiled potatoes. Women found small ways to cope, rebel, or at least remain conscious. Let's talk aprons. Yes, aprons. Those swaths of linen or cotton weren't just for catching flour or baby drool. They were early multifunction tools. Pot holders, tear wipers, oven mitts, child snatchers, fly swatters, and emergency head coverings when Aunt Judith dropped by without warning. An apron could dictate status. Hand-quilted ones hinted at respectable domesticity, while stained muslin signaled a woman was too busy wrestling with a wood stove to care how she looked while doing it. Then there were sewing circles. Innocent sounding, yes, but these gatherings were the social equivalent of an encrypted group chat. Sure, there was stitching. In fact, you were absolutely expected to bring something to mend or hem. But it was also a chance to swap stories, vent frustrations, and subtly compete to see whose husband was worst at splitting firewood. One such gathering, held monthly among the good ladies of Springfield, Missouri, became so elaborate that it required a rotating hostess schedule, tea biscuits, and allegedly, a handcrafted crown for the queen of quilting. A mean-spirited award perhaps, but a morale booster nonetheless. Then came recipes. Not the kind you find on calming blogs with 15 paragraphs about someone's grandmother's goose. We're talking survival guides in food form. Recipes passed from woman to woman were often less about cuisine and more instructional scrolls for avoiding disaster. One such handwritten gem reads, "Boil stew for no less than 4 hours. If chicken still moves after second hour, add more onions and speak firmly." Some women kept diaries. Not flowery Victorian prose riddled with romantic yearning, but practical logbooks of chaos. One 1873 housewife from Ohio wrote, "Tuesday, saved butter from going off by accident. Lost 2 hairpins. Husband says he might build second shelf. I remain skeptical." It's easy to imagine her scribbling under candlelight, children snoring on straw mattresses, her feet soaking in tepid water, dreaming of running a criminal empire where no one ever asked where their socks were. Morale mattered. So did small victories. A pot that didn't burn. A toddler who didn't eat the soap that week. A Sunday where you stole 30 quiet minutes with a penny newspaper and managed to read an entire article before being summoned to fix the stair rail. Again. There were homemade foot salves, often made of lard and herbs, that promised to soothe throbbing ankles. And let's be honest, if you've been hauling water and scrubbing cast iron from dawn to dusk, your ankles needed more than a spa day. They needed a formal apology. Still, there were golden hours. Twilight brought a little hush. Once supper was served, usually something hearty and entirely beige. There'd be time to sit by the fire. You'd undo the corset laces under your dress a notch or two. No one saw. The children, if not already asleep on a haze mattress, were at least horizontal somewhere. You let the wash soak till morning and told yourself it counted as planning ahead. Night soothed what daylight demanded, and the quiet was its own luxury. And tomorrow, well, in tomorrow's early dawn, the kitchen range would demand stoking, and you'd be ready, or at least vertical. But in the soft flicker of firelight, with creaky floorboards settling, you could let your aching hands rest and remember something extraordinary. You were still here, still creating something that mattered, more than meat pies and starch, something quietly resilient. Now, let's murmur our way toward tomorrow's topic, the surprisingly dramatic lives of chamber pots. Yes, they had lives. Just wait. As dawn crept over the rooftops like a cat too dignified to run, but too sneaky to be noticed, the 1800s housewife was already knee-deep in one of the most arduous aspects of her daily routine: laundry. Now, if you're imagining a quaint little clothesline strung with sunlit petticoats drifting gently in the breeze, allow me to gently tip those rose-colored spectacles off your nose and replace them with a steaming wooden washtub, a thumping heavy mangle, and fingers red from lye soap. Ah, laundry day, or more accurately, laundry days plural, because in many 19th century homes, especially in rural areas, washing clothes consumed the better part of a full 2 to 3 days. And we aren't talking spring fresh scented pods and programmable washing machines here. No, sir. We're talking water that had to be fetched by hand, often from a well or stream, then boiled on the stove, which itself required firewood that someone probably chopped, possibly while mumbling about laundry. Monday was the traditional wash day, because naturally, you'd want to begin your week by boiling your undergarments in cauldrons like some sort of Victorian laundry witch. Women would begin by sorting garments by fabric type and colour. Remember, dyes were temperamental, and a rogue red stocking could turn your chemise into something more suitable for a rebellious young poet. Whites were washed separately, often with added starch to keep them as stiff as societal expectations. Rubbing boards, sometimes called washboards, were the exfoliating spa treatments nobody wanted. Women would lean over deep tubs for hours, running clothing back and forth over metal ridges with a fierce scrubbing that would put modern gym routines to shame. This process resulted in very clean clothes and very sore shoulders. Soap, if it could be called that without hurting Lye's feelings, was a homemade concoction involving rendered animal fat and copious amounts of caustic soda. Women often made their own, which meant keeping barrels of leftover fat from cooking collected and cured, like one might do with fine cheese, only greasier. When soap supply ran low, a dreaded event, emergency batches had to be rendered. This was a smelly task dreaded by any soul with functioning nostrils. Once the clothes were scrubbed to submission, they were wrung out by hand or twisted through a hand-cranked wringer. And this is where sleeves and patience were often lost. The wringer, formerly known as a mangle, and informally known as that evil metal sandwich crusher, was a two-roller mechanism designed to squeeze out extra water. Unfortunately, it also enjoyed eating lace collars and occasionally an entire knuckle. And the drying process? Oh, sweet summer child. Not automatic, and certainly not fast. Clothes were hung outdoors whenever the winds weren't howling or the chickens weren't pecking curiously at linens. Indoor drying took place near stoves or fireplaces, turning the parlour into something between a boutique and a swamp. The scent of damp drawers mingled with stew, producing aromas Hyacinth Bucket would never forgive. Ironing clothes came after drying and should have been considered an underappreciated form of horizontal mountain climbing. Flat irons, solid lumps of metal heated directly on the stove, weighed around 5 to 10 pounds each. As one cooled, another was heated, and the ironing itself was performed on specialized boards or the dining table, after removing all evidence of mealtime. This was a time-consuming and wrist-aching task, especially when faced with endless rows of petticoats, all lovingly ruffled by someone with a vendetta against ironing. But even amid these trials, women found their moments of clever defiance. Some stoically skipped minor washings in winter, convincing everyone they were embracing natural warmth layers. Others paired up, timing their wash days together, turning communal laundering into a tightly scheduled gossip hour. And clever mothers learned to rotate their children's outfits so creatively that it bordered on probability magic. In surprising ways, laundry weathered the passage of the century not as a chore but as a kind of resilient ritual. It wasn't just about getting clothes clean, though that was certainly part of it. It was about showing care, preserving dignity, and wresting a semblance of control from fabric, soap, and time. And as we fold the last unruly frock and rest our legs by an imaginary cast iron stove, it's time to gently consider another form of domestic trial. One bathed in candlelight, laced with needles, and stitched with finer threads. The flicker of kerosene lanterns played across the warbled glass windows of farmhouse kitchens, casting long shadows over the women bent in synchrony above wooden tables, pastry crusts, and turnip tops. For a generation of 19th century women, the kitchen was not merely a room. It was the epicenter of smoky alchemy and daily resilience. The place where meals, maladies, and mild existential crises were all kneaded together like dough under flowered palms. Imagine Caroline, 36 years old, 4 children, 1 livestock-related limp and hands slightly pickled from lye soap. Her morning began not with a siren song or a motivational podcast, but with the bleating of a goat that had somehow escaped again. She chased it in her nightdress, because who in 1807 had time to be chased by decency? Breakfast didn't cook itself, of course. Porridge, cornbread, and perhaps a salt pork slice for the lucky. The fire had to be stoked, the kindling chopped, usually the job of a husband or a particularly opinionated 9-year-old. But when those options were unavailable, Caroline simply did it herself, muttering gentle poetry to the smoke as it puffed into her corneas. You see, these women didn't just cook. They provisioned. Pickling, preserving, drying, smoking, all the ings were essential. Not just to save groceries, but to outrun starvation in February. Canning wasn't a hobby. It was war games against winter. And the opponent, spoilage, a silent, mushy villain. Now, take a moment to picture the stove of the 1800s. Oh, it wasn't the polite rectangle humming in your kitchen today. No buttons, no beeps, unless you count your cousin's attempts at whistling. These were cast iron beasts, gulping wood like a Victorian uncle at a punch bowl. Temperature control? Recipes might say, bake in a moderate oven, which was code for guess wildly and pray. Women would hold their hands near the stove to measure the heat. If you could count to 10 before your skin caught fire, perfect for bread. 3 seconds, boil the hope from your peas. And this was happening while hauling water from the spring. No sink, just buckets and biceps. Every drop of dishwater, bathing water, or tea water had a commute. Gravity was not on their side. Laundry days. Ah yes, the Olympic sport of rural femininity. Mondays were for washing, which meant scrubbing over washboards until your knuckles resembled decorative radishes. Water was boiled in iron kettles, clothing beaten with paddles, and lye soap added with enough caution to make a science teacher sweat. And yet, balance was found. Women embroidered, sang lullabies, whispered through batches of biscuits. They knew 1,000 recipes for cornbread and twice as many for heartache. They stitched broken drawers and broken dreams with the same worn needle and thread. Let's not forget the skirts. Miles of fabric swirling around their legs as they stirred and swept. A walking fire hazard in gingham. But those yards of cloth also carried secrets. Letters tucked in apron pockets. Maybe a peppermint to hush a child. Even a sliver of chocolate if the general store hadn't become too stingy with rationing. Children, clinging to petticoats, learned to churn butter before they could spell it. Toddlers grew up watching calloused hands twirl dough like a performance, breadcrumbs of resilience trailing behind every meal these women conjured. And all this while navigating pregnancies, menstrual cycles, and the occasional molasses-related crisis with no aspirin, no Lysol, and certainly no DoorDash. But still, there were moments. In the late afternoon hush, when light sliced through lace curtains and the bread was rising just so, there was grace in it too, exhaustion laced with pride, a calm born not of idleness, but endurance, the hush you feel after the tense sigh when the floor really is clean enough, and the fire has agreed to stay flickering for just a little while longer. As twilight slipped its violet gloves over the prairie, Caroline sat by the hearth with a child in her lap and a cat daring to make territory of her skirt. Another day done, not perfectly, but beautifully in its own battered way. Now, hush your mind and rest your eyes, for soon we'll step into the world of women's tools, not hammers and saws, but thimbles, churns, and a mysterious contraption known only as the mangle. As the clink of spoons and creak of wooden floorboards faded into the hush of another long day, let us peer into one more curious corner of domestic life in the 1800s, the artful ordeal known as laundry, a word that now conjures thoughts of rinse cycles and misleading care labels, once summoned visions of full-body labor, elbow grease, and soap made from, well, lard and lies. Mondays were laundry days, not by law, but by a kind of national suffering agreement. Women across rural farmhouses and brick townhouses alike faced the week's beginning armed with boiling cauldrons, wooden paddles, and the deep, resigned sigh of someone about to do battle with a mountain of uncooperative soiled garments. There was no escape, no skipping ahead to tumble dry low. There wasn't even a tumble. Laundry began with water. Not running water, oh no, more like walking to fetch water. Buckets hauled from streams, wells, or rain barrels, then heaved indoors where they waited to be poured into a cast iron kettle the size of a toddler hippopotamus. And once that kettle was suspended over a kitchen hearth and filled with cold water, it had to be heated into a rolling boil, which took, well, time. Time and an ever-dwindling stockpile of firewood. To this bubbling witch's brew was added laundry soap, homemade naturally, unless one lived near a mercantile stocked with imported fancies. This soap wasn't pearly or shaped like a seashell. It was a chalky grey chunk concocted by combining lye with rendered animal fat. Lye, in this context, being dangerous, caustic, and as gentle as a honey badger. But it worked, they said, and your apron smelled faintly of bacon, which was a bonus or a hazard depending on proximity to bears. Once the hot, soapy water was ready, in went the clothes. Usually whites first, then progressively grimier colours, ensuring that all garments shared the same murky soup of ambition and past transgressions. Women stirred them painstakingly with a paddle, like some perverse stew of undergarments and kerchiefs, letting the boiling lye water tease the dirt from delicate threads. No spin cycle here, dear listener. Only stir, scrub, rinse, wrench, repeat. And yes, they rinsed. In fresh, frigid water fetched anew for the privilege, clothes were dunked and swished in earnest, removing what soap remained and nerves didn't. But if you think the laundry was now ready for a quick tumble around the dryer, I regret to inform you that the next step involved wringing the water out by hand, which meant twisting heavy, saturated bolts of fabric until your arms gave up and your soul considered a quieter existence, perhaps as a mushroom. Then came the hanging. Outside, weather permitting, or inside if storms or colder months conspired. Indoors, this meant draping endless garments over furniture, lines strung eerily through parlours, and especially near stoves, because nothing says elegance like bloomers steaming beside a soup pot. And let's not forget ironing. If clothes survived the prior stages, they were laid out for the blazing crown, jewel of 19th century perfectionism, the flat iron. This device appeared innocent enough, a solid hunk of metal with a handle, but it had to be heated directly on a stove or fire. And once hot, it stayed that way only briefly, urging women to sprint through wrinkles faster than decency allowed. Using tongs to swap irons in and out of the heat, they pressed sleeves and flounces until garments lay smooth, stiff, and perhaps harbouring the slight burn mark of mild emotional defeat. Now, here's the truly dizzying part. This routine, this boiling, steeping, wringing, hanging, and pressing dignified frenzy, was done weekly. Laundry Monday didn't just mean one day of consistent drudgery. It meant Monday was the laundry day. Tuesday might be finish drying day. Wednesday could be ironing until your scapula files for divorce day. And Thursday was for putting it all away in drawers the mice had claimed as summer homes. And there was no break in the rhythm, because the thing about family clothing is that it does not, out of kindness or basic human consideration, stop getting dirty. Yet somehow, amid steam and soap and hang-dried chaos, there was a strange resilience threaded between the clothespins. Women shared techniques and gossip over laundry lines, passed recipes for better soap, or at least soap that didn't dissolve fingernails, and trained daughters in the sacred geometry of folding bloomers. In the bubbles and bustle, they kept houses clean and communities tied together with apron strings and steam. The soft hiss of the iron and faint rumble of drying linens eventually tapered off, fading into the hush of the evening. Outside, the wind carried hints of lavender and lye beneath the moonlit lines of drying shirts, and as the stars blinked down on the weary shoulders of another scrubbed and scalded week, we turned quietly now, drifting gently toward the parlour, where another curious domestic ritual awaited, and it required nothing less than a head for heights, a duster, and the balance of a tightrope walker. In the mid-1800s, the humble task of doing laundry was not a chore. It was an extreme sport, and the women of the era, oh, they were the Olympians of domestic grit, the unsung champions of suds and steam. Let's drift softly into a Monday, because Monday was traditionally wash day, as ordained by both folklore and the frightening pile of laundry that blocked the back door. Imagine a gentle fog rolling over a rural homestead, a rooster crowing somewhere on cue, and Clara, a fictional but thoroughly representative housewife, already elbow-deep in what she referred to as the weekly soak. She'd rise before sunrise, tie a kerchief over her hair like a pioneer war banner, and set to work hauling buckets of water with the kind of upper body strength modern gyms try to sell back to us with kettlebells. Washing in the 1800s began not with the clothes, but with the water itself, a precious, stubborn thing that refused to appear magically through a faucet. No water had to be drawn from the well, or, for the truly luxurious, pumped in by hand into a tin tub that could almost have doubled as a moonshine still. Next came the soap, which sounds innocuous until you realized it was often homemade lye soap. Now, lye is the sort of substance that can dissolve a spoon if left unsupervised. So handling it with bare hands required a sturdy constitution, weathered skin, and no concern whatsoever for future allergies. The actual washing employed scrub boards, corrugated metal slabs that gave clothing and triceps alike a thorough workout. Women would stoop beside the tub, rhythmically scrubbing linens against the board with the mechanical precision of a player piano, while keeping one eye on the boiling pot of water simmering nearby. This wasn't just to heat the water, mind you. It was to kill whatever cow-assisted bacteria had taken up residence in Junior's only pair of breeches. Bedsheets were soaked, socks were scoured, petticoats were twisted into submission, and all of it was done while clad in floor-length skirts and tight corsets, because Victorian fashion demanded its own comedy of errors. By midday, the air around the house would be a steamy blend of wet cotton, sun-drenched grass, and the faint whiff of scorched starch. The yard would blossom with laundry suspended on sagging lines, held aloft by wooden pegs, and the quiet prayer that it wouldn't rain. Birds were scolded vocally for daring to fly overhead. Children were kept at bay, very possibly with threats and the ominous waving of a wet bloomers. Then came the ironing. And before you picture a dainty little plug-in friend humming helpfully on a board, let me correct you. 1800s irons were known as sad irons, and not because they lacked optimism. The word sad originally meant heavy, and oh, were they ever. Cast iron blocks that had to be heated on the stove and handled with thick rags lest your fingertips roast like chestnuts in a Dickensian fireplace. Each iron would stay hot for approximately 7 minutes before it was returned to the stove and swapped out for its identical twin in what can only be described as a tragic iron relay. But here's something rather heartwarming, perhaps even dreamy in its quiet way. Wash days weren't just a solitary slog. Often, women in communities or neighborhoods would gather together, forming informal laundering alliances. Here, under the open sky, conversations bubbled over like boiling water on the hearth, and young girls learned their chores, while older women applied wisdom in between soap rations. It wasn't just about laundry. It was about connection, shared strength, and a collective sigh at the finish line. Of course, by the end of it, Clara, our representative washerwoman, would collapse into a chair beside that now empty wash tub, her hands pruny, her back protesting, and her spirit only marginally defeated by an especially rebellious tea towel. But the household was clean. The barn cat slept nestled in warm, sun-dried linens, and the breeze carried away the final notes of starch and steam. As the sun dipped low, washing hung like ghostly flags on the line, and the world, at least for a time, was freshly scrubbed. Just beyond the fence, a neighbor girl wandered over with a head full of questions and a basket full of wrinkled sheets, eager to master the mysterious dark art of folding fitted linens. Yes, even then, they were the textile puzzles no one truly solved. And as lanterns flickered to life in the settling dusk, our attention begins to shift indoors, where another crucial frontier of domesticity was humming patiently: the kitchen stove. somewhere between the clatter of cast iron pots and the existential sigh of a butter churn. Women of the 1800s managed to uncover a remarkable survival skill: delegation. Not the sort that earns an applause in corporate meetings. This was housebound, apron-tied, occasionally passive-aggressive delegation. And its prime manifesta, the humble concept of the help. Now, when people today say they have help around the house, they're likely referring to a Roomba that whirs beneath couches and occasionally eats shoelaces. But in the 1800s, help came in the form of flesh and blood individuals, cousins, neighbors' daughters, or even entire boarding school girls surprised into domestic apprenticeships simply because they visited for tea. The hierarchy of household labor was often improvised like a quilt, stitched from whatever scraps were at hand. If a woman couldn't afford an official servant, which, let's be honest, most couldn't, she might borrow a niece for the summer or prematurely promote her 8-year-old son to assistant wood chopper and occasional bedmaker. Children weren't just children back then, they were auxiliary staff. Little Sarah might be expected to sweep so hard her broom resembled a medieval jousting lance. Tiny Henry, despite being 3 apples high and unqualified by modern OSHA standards, could be found perched on a stool over a giant washtub, stirring laundry with the gravitas of a ship captain, navigating stormy seas. Soap, mind you, was gritty and judgmental, full of lie and fewer regrets than one might expect. And let us not forget the well-worn system of trading labor the way one might trade sugar or scandalous gossip. Women who lived in small communities, especially in rural America, became absolute champions of mutual aid, even if they didn't call it that. The logic was simple. I'll help you birth a baby on Wednesday if you show up to pluck chickens with me on Saturday. One can only imagine the scheduling vortex created by such transactions, but it worked somehow between sips of coffee and biscuit crumbs on the windowsill. In some homes where fortune smiled slightly, usually in the form of land ownership or a timely inheritance from an uncle who fell off a horse at the right time, families might employ a full-time servant. But let us not envision Jane Austen elegance here. A servant might share a bed with the children, eat scraps after dinner, and have the job security of a snowflake in June. Yet often, these women did gain invaluable skills, networked through whispers behind laundry lines, and sometimes even rose, over years, to roles akin to today's estate managers, except without the clipboard or weekends off. But perhaps the most overlooked helper in any 1800s household was delegation to oneself. True multitasking, the kind where a woman could churn butter with her feet while rocking a cradle with her knee and memorizing scripture with her eyeballs. It was a mental acrobatics routine that would glitter on any resume, if time machines were hiring. Of course, this relentless activity led to what we today might gingerly label as burnout, but was more commonly known back then as sighing a lot while staring out windows, or occasionally throwing a wooden spoon across the yard. Entire personal philosophies were cooked up during these long days. The chance to daydream while peeling apples or concoct meaning beneath the repetitive clang of the washtub lid. One must also mention the luckless hands of husbands when left alone in the home, mistakenly loading the stove with green wood, or attempting to sweep, and instead just kind of pushing the dirt into a philosophical pile. Women, in turn, became adept at giving instructions so specific they could rival military briefings. Don't touch the kettle till it sings 3 times, not 2, and don't confuse that with the hawk outside, which also screams at noon. Yes, survival didn't always look glamorous. It looked like routines and planning, and the occasional strategic collapse onto a kitchen chair, but through improvisation, collaboration, gritty optimism, and a rotating cast of helpers, real or imagined, these women sustained their homes and their spirits. And speaking of helpers, next, we tiptoe into one of the most beloved and battled over contraptions in any 1800s home. The glorious, infuriating, and occasionally haunted wood-burning stove. As the light wavered through the wavy glass panes of an 1800s kitchen window, wobbly and full of secrets, something magical was happening just beyond the hearth. Not a spell or a miracle, mind you, but something far rarer in that era. A woman boldly, unapologetically sitting down. Now, this may not sound like much. Today, we plop onto couches with all the ceremony of a dropped potato. But in the 19th century, when women bore the brunt of household labor from sunrise to long past sunset, the simple act of resting, of placing posterior to chair, was akin to a revolution. Let's take a leisurely stroll into the world of 1800s rest strategies, or as I like to call them, the secret society of stealthy sitters. You see, women were expected to be in near constant motion, churning butter with one hand, stirring porridge with the other, and somehow mending a sock with their toes. Sitting idle invited judgment, not just from husbands or neighbors, but from their own internalized sense of duty, handed down through generations and reinforced by stern chickens and even sterner calendar illustrations of the ideal housewife. So how did these women sneak in self-preservation without an uprising of aprons and rolling pins? The answer, my dear dozing listener, lies in the quiet genius of intentional idleness disguised as productivity. Let's begin with the holy grail of fake busyness, shelling peas. Shelling peas, much like writing lukewarm poetry or rearranging the mantel decor for the 13th time, was a wonderful excuse to sit completely still while appearing marvelously earnest. Set up by the window with a big tin basin and a look of noble concentration, a woman could clock in an honest hour of conversational rest, with the added bonus of preparing something green and vaguely nutritious for supper. Then there was the beloved knitting strategy, where men of the time could lean against posts, whittling wood blocks with impressive nonchalance. Women wielded needles, a blanket on the needles, rocking chair squeaking in time, and voila, a socially sanctioned set. Bonus points if you sighed dramatically and muttered something like, "If I don't finish this before the first frost, the baby's toes will likely fall clean off," even if the baby had outgrown the blanket entirely. Ironing was another curious trick in the domestic hat. Yes, it was tedious, hot, and required moderately functional elbows. But depending on the setup, it allowed for moments of stillness. The iron itself had to be reheated on the stove every 10 minutes or so, giving women the opportunity to wait. That's right, wait. Standing still, back turned to any onlookers, with eyes closed for just a second, or maybe 5. A brief retreat into the landscape of the mind, where no one was yelling about spilt lard or requesting a sandwich with alarming urgency. But perhaps the grandest covert leisure move of all was the visit. Social calls were, in theory, a duty. Maintaining social fabric, checking on a new baby, bringing over this month's salve, all excellent reasons to appear in someone else's parlour. But in practice, visits allowed for sitting, sipping lukewarm tea, exchanging recipes involving salted pork and despair, and crucially, talking. Actual talking that didn't involve explaining why the laundry still looked a touch smoke-scented even after 2 rinses. These visits ran on an unwritten code. Women knew not to inspect the baseboards too closely, and never asked why the molasses cake seemed to have cedar shavings in it. Because the point wasn't perfection, it was pause. It was mutual unwinding, one gossip-laced spoonful of gooseberry preserves at a time. Not all strategies were so poetic. Some did involve the occasional forgotten task. Perhaps the potatoes mysteriously never got peeled because someone accidentally reread a letter from Cousin May 3 times. Perhaps water had to be drawn one bucket at a time, very slowly, with long, reflective minute stares into the well. Were these delays lazy? No, they were strategic. A micro-snooze in the name of longevity. Occupational rest stretching at its finest. And in all of this, an important truth rippled quietly like wind through a drying line. These women were smart, indisputably, unrelentingly clever. They didn't simply survive the grind. They found ways to outwit it, wrapping little fragments of rest in linen layers of duty. Because even the hardest day could be softened by sitting on the edge of the root cellar stairs and pretending to look for onions. Beyond these artful interludes of rest, there was another quiet rebellion brewing. This time, in the very tools women used for their work, or rather, how they subtly altered them. But that, dear dreamer, is a tale best told on a breathier breeze. In the early hush of morning, just before the children stirred, and the roosters made their shrill declarations of dawn superiority, the women of the 1800s began the delicate ballet of soot, starch, and survival known as Laundry Day. A misnomer, truly, for laundering in that era was less a day and more a full-on aquatic campaign of heavy lifting, hot irons, and the subtle negotiation of wet linens versus dry dignity. It began with water, of course, that fickle liquid that modern taps have so kindly domesticated. But in the 19th century, fetching water amounted to a strength training regimen with no discernible health insurance. Buckets were carted from wells or hand-pumped from yards, sometimes requiring multiple trips just to fill one washtub. Rain barrels, too, played their part, collecting the sky's offerings like little environmental piggy banks. Then came the heating. And here we pause to appreciate something quite dear to the hearts of 1800s women: fire. Not the cozy, marshmallow roasting kind. Oh no, but the sort that belched smoke and asked rude questions about one's chimney maintenance. Stoking a wood-burning stove to bring an immense pot of water to a loyal boil required more patience than luring a cat into a bathtub. Once boiling, the water was ladled or poured into tin or wooden wash basins that sometimes seemed deep enough to harbour emotionally complex trout. Soap, that great equalizer of the domestic world, was often homemade. Lye soap, also affectionately dubbed Grandma's exfoliant of terror, was created by mixing wood ash with rendered animal fat. Women didn't just wash laundry, they dissolved the sins right off of it. The resulting bar was effective, yes, but could also double as industrial cleaner or an impromptu disciplinary tool for mouthy children. Clothing was scrubbed against washboards, the original six-pack builders using bony knuckles, determination, and a fair bit of suppressed screaming. Delicate items were delicately thrashed with less force, while heavier fabrics like overalls fought back harder than a drunk uncle at a barn dance. And let's not underestimate the rinse process, which involved lifting swamps of dripping cotton from one tub to another like sloshing around buckets of grumpy eels. This rinsing needed achieving multiple times to rid garments of soap and residual regrets. By noon, the average housewife's triceps were sculpted enough to take down a small bear. But the pièce de résistance was ringing. Before ringers became available, delightful contraptions that mashed water out of fabric like flat pasta emerging from a mechanical torturer. Everything had to be hand-twisted. Women would grip opposite ends of a sodden sheet, twist with all of Poseidon's fury, and hope that most of the Atlantic Ocean would exit before hanging. Ah yes, the clothesline. A high-stakes tightrope balancing act requiring an eye for sunshine, barometric instincts, and pegs that didn't believe in loyalty. Items were flung onto lines stretched across yards, porches, or, in moments of dire weather drama, entire indoor hallways. Breezes were welcomed like long-lost family members and overcast skies viewed as traitorous saboteurs. Drying itself could take hours or days, depending on whether the weather believed in letting laundry live. And woe to the housewife whose clean linens were blindsided by a flock of wayward birds or a neighbor's exuberant chimney. Once dry, ironing awaited like a boss level in an exhausting video game. Irons were hulking metal triangles heated directly on the stove and wielded with oven-mitt valor. There was no temperature dial, only experience, and the understanding that hesitation could leave scorch patterns shaped like disappointed ancestors. The ironing resisted long sleeps or gentle meditations. It was meticulous work, especially with pleats, collars, and anything involving ruffles, which had a secret agenda of revenge. And when, finally, the mountain of garments was crisp, folded, and smelling faintly of soap, smoke, and victory, the woman would sit, perhaps with a warm biscuit or a tepid cup of tea, staring out the small kitchen window. Not for leisure, but in case it looked like her laundried nemesis, the weather, might be planning another strike. Some might say laundry back then was harder than storming a castle. Others, more honest still, would compare it to battling the laundry monster with nothing but a fork and an exhausted optimism. But there was power hidden in those wrung-out towels and sun-dried skirts, a quiet rebellion stitched together with necessity and tenacity, a soft revolution spun from cotton and sweat. And tomorrow, well, the linens might stay clean for a few hours until someone poured gravy into their lap or used a shirt as a napkin again. Rest now, for the next domestic ordeal glimmers gently on the horizon, just beyond the steam of the washtub. As the warm dusk of the 1800s household settled over the creaky wooden floors and soot-smudged window panes, the shadow of the almighty laundry day loomed with the solemnity of a religious holiday, except instead of hymns, there was grunting, scrubbing, and swearing under one's breath, while battling a washtub the size of a whiskey barrel. Laundry day. The very phrase could strike dread into the bones of a prairie woman with 5 children and 1 dress between them. The act of washing clothes in the 19th century was not so much a chore as it was an epic crusade involving smoke, steam, and elbows on the brink of rebellion. And above it all stood the unsung heroine of the home front, the laundress, who, with her arms of iron and patience of a saint, waged weekly war against grime, grease, and the mysterious stains that somehow appeared after church, picnics. Let's begin with the tools of the trade, which, to the modern eye, resembled implements of gentle torture. Chief among them was the scrub board, a rippled sheet of metal or glass framed in wood, over which clothes were dragged with feeling. It was essentially a cheese grater for clothing, and sometimes for knuckles. The wash tub, often made of tin or wood, would be filled with boiling water, thanks to a cauldron-esque kettle simmering on the wood stove. Water, of course, had to be lugged in by hand. It wasn't like you could just twist a faucet and let it flow like magic. No, if you wanted hot water, you walked to the pump, maybe even the creek, gathered it in iron pails, and hauled it back, arms aching, wishing just one time someone else would offer to carry the second bucket. Soap was homemade, usually, and it was not the lavender-scented luxury of future spa baskets. No, it was lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, smelling faintly of barnyard and possessing all the gentleness of a sandpaper facial. It could strip grease, dirt, and, on less fortunate days, the pigment from fabric. But it did the trick, and really, there was something triumphant about lifting a linen shirt from the suds, watching the murk drip away, knowing the family would, for one day at least, look slightly less feral. The washing alone took hours, especially when dissecting the villainy known as Monday's wash day. Many women washed everything in one go: sheets, drawers, petticoats, stockings, aprons, baby things, and the occasional surprise squirrel that had made its home in a pocket set aside for mending. Then came the rinsing, in a second tub of clearer water, and sometimes a third. If you had fancy ambitions, you might even scent your rinse with bluing, a bit of indigo to trick the eye into thinking your laundry was oh so white. After rinsing came the wrangling of excess water by means of wringing manually, or, for the much envied few, via a hand-cranked wringer. These were two rollers between which clothes were fed like a panicked letter through a typewriter. Wringers were notorious for eating sleeves, buttons, and fingers with equal hunger. Children were strictly warned not to touch them, which, of course, made them touch it. And then, the drying. No quiet tumble in a dryer here. Laundry was gallantly pegged to lines strung across backyards, attics, or kitchens if the weather misbehaved. In winter, you risked bringing frozen bloomers inside, stiff as boards and making eerie knocking sounds in the wind. In summer, the sun obliged, lending your drawers the fresh scent of grass and sky. Now, it may surprise you to know, all this was not the end. No. Once dry, clothes were ironed with implements called sadirans, or flat irons. These ebony-handled metal beasts were heated on the stove, flipped, and used quickly before their warmth dissipated. If you had two, you could alternate, one heating while the other flattened your corset cover into submission. Ironing required strength, timing, and a refined tolerance for mild burns. Despite all this labor, laundry day was oddly communal. Neighbors swapped gossip over steaming basins, children played tug-of-war with mislaid bloomers, and there was a shared understanding that should anyone receive a wrinkle-free shirt on a Tuesday, it had come at great personal cost. So when you slip into your machine-washed pajamas and climb into clean sheets without once boiling a kettle or making your own soap from bacon drippings, take a sleepy moment to thank the women of the past, the ones who scoured out stains with sinew and soul, turned wringing laundry into an upper body workout, and still managed to bake a pie before dark. Next, we'll gently drift into the pantry, where the 1800s kitchen held a host of small survival secrets, some practical, some peculiar, and all smelling faintly of pickles. The wind rustled faintly outside the window pane, brushing against the glass like a child asking to come in, while inside the parlor, a kettle rattled softly on the iron stove. It was the soundscape of countless 19th century homes, where household labor carried a rhythm of its own. Scrub, stir, sew, repeat. But tonight, we come to a quieter corner of domestic history, not the endless chores themselves, but the small, rebellious luxuries nestled in between them. Because believe it or not, even in the age of hand-churned butter and coal-smudged petticoats, women occasionally stopped working. And when they did, oh, how sweet the stolen moment. Take, for example, the parlor. It wasn't merely a room, it was a stage, carefully dusted and embroidered, where the better side of life was meant to flourish. Lace antimacassars sat primly on armchairs, and portraits of stern ancestors watched from gilt frames, judging your choice of tea biscuit. But in this curated sanctuary, women found slender slices of time for themselves. Afternoon tea was one such act of quiet rebellion, ostensibly about entertaining guests, but often gloriously guest-free. It was a chance to sit, sip, and, if one was particularly daring, read a book not about pickling or moral virtue. Novels, you see, had taken root in the domestic garden, and not just the pious kind. Some women hid copies of Madame Bovary or the scandalous serialized adventures of lady detectivesses beneath lace table runners, as though stashing contraband. One could, after all, be both domestic and deviously literate. This was a time when reading too much fiction as a woman was considered, with eyebrow-singeing seriousness, a sign of mental fragility. Doctors, the very sort who recommended whale oil enemas and mercury poultices, warned that too many novels could compromise a lady's uterus, or worse, inspire thoughts of independence. And yet, from New England to the Dakotas, women read anyway, thumbing past chapters by candlelight after supper, a candle stub balanced on an overturned teacup. Crafting, too, offered a modest escape, not necessarily for the making of clothes, though a pair of woolen stockings could put up a good fight before surrendering to a New England winter, but for the more refined pastimes, embroidery, tatting lace, or the ancient and mystical art of folding laundry into decorative swans. Okay, perhaps not that last one, but you get the idea. Every stitch was both a duty and a meditation, where thoughts could wander safely through daydreams or silently plotted family improvements. And let us not forget gossip. It may not appear in your typical household inventory of tools and tins, but it was very much essential to survival. At quilting bees, wash day stoops, and church picnics, women traded recipes, rumors, and news, those invisible threads binding their separate burdens into a shared, if whispered, resistance. It's an underrated skill, exchanging coded messages about Aunt Mercy's third headache this week, while wrangling a boiling stew pot and 2 toddlers. These were not idle pastimes. They were breathers, social and emotional exhalations in a week, strung taut with work. One curious reprieve came in the form of the travelling salesman. Yes, a man in a tweed jacket trying to sell you a mangle isn't usually the stuff of dreams. But in the 1800s, the appearance of someone from the wider world was a rare and welcome anomaly. He might be selling soap flakes or the latest in carpet sweepers, but he also brought news, anecdotes, a sense that life existed beyond the picket fence and the privy. A brief conversation at the door might be the most exotic interaction all month. Miniature diplomatic relations held over molasses cake and a product demonstration. Of course, not all rest was rebellion. Some women, especially those with means, made domestic leisure its own occupation. Ladies' journals brimmed with editorial ambition, advice columns, poetry contests, etiquette diagrams for napkin folding that looked suspiciously like advanced origami. It was a new terrain where women's voices, though still hemmed in by corsets and convention, began to stretch and pirouette. Ink and imagination flowed from kitchen tables as women dared to write, to correspond, to claim the odd hour or two as their own. So in the brief hush between supper and bedtime, when the hearth glow softened the edges of the room and the day's last chore had finally been laid to rest, rest itself became a subtle act of defiance, a pause, a cup of tea, a stolen chapter of Jane Eyre. Not freedom, perhaps, but the rehearsal of it. And as the clock struck the quiet hour once more, we'll drift next toward the most mysterious miracle of 19th century housekeeping. How in the world they managed to keep everyone clothed with just a needle, sheer willpower, and approximately 17 different kinds of buttons. Let's ease our way into the more fragrant side of 1800s domestic life, though fragrant might be misleading if your imagination just pictured lavender sachets or a pine-fresh breeze drifting in through gingham curtains. No, tonight we're delving into the rituals of laundering, the sacred sponge-wielding ceremonies that turned Mondays into medieval trials. Ah yes, wash day. The domestic equivalent of a marathon, if marathons involved boiling lye water, hauling vats the size of bathtubs, and wrangling every damp flannel undergarment known to humanity. And while we're at it, do remember there's no washing machine, not even a cranky, bulgy one from the 1950s. These women were scrubbing by hand on washboards so rough they could double as cheese graters. Now, Mondays were wash days by tradition, and not for any charming astrological reason. No, it simply made logistical sense. Sunday was the Sabbath, a day of rest. So naturally, come Monday, the laundry had accumulated into something approaching geological strata. Children's frocks stiff with dirt, men's shirts boasting mysterious patches of soot and bacon gravy, and the ever-growing mound of bloomers, often deserving their own moment of silence. The process began around dawn. First, you had to start a fire. This, of course, meant kindling, splitting wood, nursing a reluctant flame, and all while half asleep and corseted. Next came hauling gallons of water. And since plumbing was best described as the bucket, it was a matter of walking, lifting, and marveling at how arm muscles could ache in places you didn't even know you had. The water would be boiled in a giant copper washtub that looked like something NASA might use to catch asteroids. Then came soap. Not from a charming pastel bottle that smells like jasmine tea, mind you. No, this was soap made at home from lye and leftover animal fat. A recipe passed down from Grandma, and also probably the reason Grandma had no fingerprints. Washing involved plunging the clothes into the scalding water, poking them with a paddle that doubled as a disciplinary stick in one's spare time, then scrubbing each item vigorously against a washboard. Shirts, petticoats, unmentionables, each treated to what can only be described as a kind of textile exorcism. All sins, the grass stains, sweat marks, biscuit crumbs, cast out with furious scrubbing. And there's the rinse stage, executed with the precision of an assembly line. First rinse water, then second rinse, sometimes a third if suits were involved, or if a relative of high standing might be visiting. Bluing solution was used to make whites look, well, whiter. It involved Prussian blue dye and gave everything a faint, improbable tint, like your underthings had attended finishing school. Then, wringing out water. You'd grab the garment, twist it with the strength of a lumberjack, and hope it didn't snap in half. Your hands would be chapped, your skirts damp, your soul halfway to Valhalla. At last, the clean but dripping items were taken outside, where you hung them on a line with wooden clothespins, the kind that held on for dear life during every ambitious gust of wind. Birds offered concertos. Chickens occasionally strutted through puddles. Children threatened to weaponize clotheslines for games that inevitably involved tripping and parental scolding. Yet, amid all this toil, there was a strange kind of satisfaction. The scent of laundry fluttering on the breeze became the unspoken badge of domestic victory. Neighbors might pass and nod at the rows of tidy linens as if applauding a personal triumph over entropy. And lest we forget, this was just laundry. It had to share the weekly schedule with churning butter, baking bread, mending, sweeping, candle dipping, gardening, and of course, reining in whatever small beastly children happened to be climbing the roof at any given moment. Still, not every home had to endure this alone. The smart ones, likely the same kind who baked 3 pies before sunrise, formed little wash-day alliances. Groups of women would gather, lend hands, share gossip, and make the whole ordeal slightly less brutal than solo warfare. These friendships, forged in hot steam and laundry soap, were sturdier than some marriages, and once, just once, when a thunderstorm rolled in to unravel their freshly dried efforts, they'd laugh. A sharp belly laugh that winds its way through exhaustion and into something like joy. And after such a day, long skirts damp at the hem and arms sore from battle, they might sit by the fire with a cup of weak tea, grateful to sit. Grateful that until next Monday, the war on grime had been won again. Next, we shall drift into the creaking pantry, where the art of preserving food tells its own tale of salt, sugar, and survival tucked in mason jars. There was a certain poetry to the way 19th century women labored. The endless motion of hands, the rhythm of chores stitched into the cadence of daily life. And nowhere was this more evident than in the battlefield of the home, pantry during the annual ritual known as preservation season. From late summer into fall, when the garden burst into one final act of flamboyant harvest glory, women across the countryside and cities alike entered full-on alchemy mode. If you had a surplus of cucumbers, tomatoes, or peaches, congratulations, you were about to suffer. Preserving food in the 1800s was not so much an activity as it was a weeks-long domestic crusade. This was the era before refrigeration, remember? To avoid the horror of winter cabbage turning to mush, or whole chickens going from farm fresh to ominously fragrant, women turned to ancient and questionably effective techniques. There was pickling, drying, brining, salting, and the always explosive art form of jarring. Let's begin with canning. Canning was first introduced in the early 1800s after Napoleon offered a prize to anyone who could create a method of preserving food for his army. Enter Nicolas Appert, the Frenchman, who thought, let's just boil it in a jar, and somehow convince the world this was a good idea. It caught on. By the mid-1800s, American homes were full of glass jars, tin lids, and a healthy sense of dread. The tools of the trade looked innocent enough. Mason jars, invented in 1858 by John Landis Mason, were the darling of preservation circles. But while the jars were a marvel, the process was an exhausting puzzle of trial, error, and moderate scalding. Picture it. A sweltering August kitchen, no fan, no ice, no central air, just the faithful heat of a wood-burning stove and approximately 6 bushels of green beans demanding eternal life in brine. The woman of the house might rise before dawn, hauling water from the well, sterilizing the jars, boiling the produce within an inch of its life, and lifting the final results out with tongs that never cooperated. Each jar hissed and clicked, and she watched like a hawk, listening for the sweet music of a proper vacuum seal. If it clicked too soon, unsafe. Too late, suspicious. Didn't click at all. You just canned dinner for that family of raccoons out back. Then there was pickling. Everything could be pickled. Eggs, onions, beets, pig's feet, watermelon rinds. Oh yes, even the rinds. Waste not, want not. Which was coincidentally the unofficial national motto of 1800s domestic labour. Recipes for pickling often read like the instructions of a witch trying to impress a vinegar mogul. Take 1 gallon of cider vinegar, a dram of mace cloves, a handful of celery seed, and 1 cup of horseradish scraped with the left hand under a waning moon. Precision was important, but mostly theoretical. If it tasted sour and didn't kill anyone, success. And let us not forget drying, a method of preservation that makes fruits more leathery and less emotionally available. Apples, squash, and even meat were sliced and laid out on wooden racks, left in the sun, and monitored daily for signs of mold, insects, or curious neighbors. Strips of jerky hanging from the rafters like delicious wind chimes became a familiar sight. Spoilage was a relentless threat. Even when every method was followed perfectly, bacteria would throw a microscopic party. Whole shelves of canned peaches could swell and burst, their once beautiful contents turning into an eerily sweet compost. Cellars might smell faintly of success, or eerily of botulism. But women persisted. Not out of hobbyist enthusiasm, though some did start competitive canning circles, because of course they did, but out of necessity. Preserving food wasn't quaint. It was survival packaged with grit. And yet, there was tenderness in the effort. Each jar lining the shelf was a gesture of care, a future meal kissed by the past. Mothers left their recipes in notebooks that crackled with old ink and jam smudges. Daughters learned by watching shoulders stoop and hands rinse peaches in rows. These preserved goods carried more than nutrients. They carried memory. Slowly, over decades, science would bring safer techniques. Pressure canning arrived, and companies like Ball offered jars with fewer injury risks and more Instagram potential. But in the heart of the 1800s, back when every sealed jar was a gamble and every pickled item a culinary dare, food preservation was less about nutrition and more about quiet heroism. And as cold winds whistled beneath wooden doors, those glowing rows of sealed jars stood like little soldiers of sustenance, whispering of sunlit orchards and warm copper kettles. Next, we'll turn our attention to the unsung magic of homemade soap, a substance as essential as food and almost as complicated to create. Evening had a particular way of settling over an 1800s household, like a woolen blanket that smelled faintly of coal smoke, pickled cabbage, and resignation. As the last glimmer of sun melted behind the rooftops of town or behind the lumpy hills of the countryside, the entire house exhaled a sigh. Women, having been up before the roosters and outlasted several candles, were still only partway done with their labors. But now came that rare slice of the day where the line between survival and preservation blurred into the noble institution known as mending. Yes, mending. The art of patching the same stockings a third time, or reattaching a button that had clearly eloped with a drawer gremlin. Mending wasn't quite as exhausting as laundry day, and it didn't involve boiling temperatures or open flames usually, but it was exacting labor nonetheless, especially by dim oil lamp shared between 4 pairs of similarly squinty eyes. Picture it. A mother of 7 sits by the hearth, her spine politely protesting every second, as she carefully darns a woolly sock. She's using a darning egg, which sounds like something you'd yell during a genteel argument, but is actually a smooth, egg-shaped tool placed inside socks to give a working surface. The darning egg might have been carved from wood, or if fortune smiled, it might have been repurposed ivory from an old piano key, one of the few relics allowed to move from gentle parlor music to emergency hosiery support device. In one hand, she holds needle and thread, in the other, an internal monologue running along the lines of, "Didn't I just sew this hole last Thursday?" And indeed, she did. But children have ways of turning socks into fine lace, especially when no one owned more than 2 pairs and one was always mysteriously wet. Now, while we're mending things, let's gently stitch together the image of the communal repair basket. It was often a cracked wooden bowl or a lopsided tin bucket, full to the brim with tangled spools, mismatched buttons, bent safety pins, and fabric scraps cut from past garments, bits of faded calico that once knew the thrill of party dresses, now demoted to knee patches. And don't be fooled. Mending wasn't merely a chore, it was a survival constraint. In many cases, clothes could not be replaced, no matter how moth-ravaged they were. You wore what you owned until threads gave way to spirit, and even then, the garment might return as a quilt square or a doll's hat. Truly, 1800s women lived the circular fashion economy decades before influencer culture gave it hashtags. Children, when not being mended themselves out of sheer willpower, were occasionally recruited for menial stitching tasks. "Fetch Mama the sharp needle," they were told, to which the child predictably returned with a parsnip. The correct needle might eventually be located, usually stuck in the cuff of someone's bloomers. And all this mending unfolded after days spent baking bread, preserving the beets, scrubbing the floors with lye, feeding the fire, and ironing with irons that were not metaphorical. They were literal heavy bricks heated in open flames, full of ambition and blisters. Still, the most graceful thread woven through this entire hour of twilight labor was conversation. Women often mended together, sometimes with neighbors, sometimes with daughters, sometimes in companionable silence that said, "I understand. This sock you're holding has defeated both of us." It was here that stories were passed, about the feral chicken that chased the pastor, or the petticoat that caught fire during last year's harvest fest and kept twirling anyway. These flickers of joy were proof that not everything that needed fixing could be stitched. Some things just needed to be shared. Thread by thread they sewed, and perhaps, almost whimsically, they stitched the family together too. With every hem restored, every frayed cuff tucked back into obedience, there was quiet influence, evidence that women were not only keepers of the house, but architects of its narratives, literal and symbolic. Now, as the lamp oil thinned and eyelids drooped gently like overripe pears, the final sock was placed beside the hearth to dry. The darning egg was returned to its drawer, possibly to be misplaced again, until a new hole emerged. And so the quiet took over. A soft, pinewood quiet, tiptoeing across the shingles like a lullaby of dust motes and embers. And somewhere beyond the mended sleeves and quiet laughter, another day was being shaped, one simple stitch at a time. Soon, we'll peek into the kitchens once more, where jars glint like jewels and secrets boil next to soup. But for now, rest easy. Of all the exhausting wonders of 1800s domestic life, few demanded as much quiet coordination and strategic cunning as the art of warding off filth. Not dramatic problems like wolves, raging plagues, or surprise chimney fires, though those certainly had their moments, but the unrelenting, invisible siege of grime, soot, and livestock-generated mud that wandered casually underneath one's floorboards. You see, the 19th century home was not the sterile lemon-scented bastion we might picture today. It was a lively, ever-evolving theatre of dust. Chimneys coughed soot into the parlour's best corners. Wood stoves shed ash with the joie de vivre of toddlers with glitter. Farm boots plodded indoors without apology. If a woman in 1807 wanted her floors to stay clean, she would have had better luck training a pig to curtsy. But should you be imagining housewives resigned to this dusty fate, think again. These women were not passive spectators. They were generals in a war against dirt, armed with brooms of bundled twigs, paste concoctions of vinegar and elbow grease, and the occasional salty reprimand for those who dared stomp the porch unwiped. They kept the chaos at bay with the grace of battlefield commanders wielding feather dusters. One unsung savior of cleanliness was the braided rug. Durable, colourful, and cleverly stitched, it could be marched outside, beaten furiously with a rug beater, a wire device that doubled as mild therapy, and returned to duty. Rugs didn't just look nice. They collected the day's sins from boots, paws, skirts, and whatever the cat dragged in, quite literally. And oh, the laundry. Yes, dear listener, the washing was a true opera of manual effort. A woman might spend an entire day, Monday usually, hauling water by the bucket to heat over a fire, stirring linens in lye soap, wringing them by hand until her elbows considered early retirement, and flinging them over lines to dry under clouds shaped like fluffier, less sarcastic judges. Clothing, of course, didn't just get dirty. It got complicated. Dresses had layers, aprons had layers. Corsets were not only a moral compass, but also managed to trap crumbs with ruthless efficiency. Baby clothes were a whole other terrain of fiddly buttons and infinite, unspeakable surprises. And all of this had to be routinely soaked, scrubbed, boiled, hoisted aloft, and ironed into submission. Irons, by the way, were made of, well, iron. Heavy wedges that had to be heated over a stove, handled with an acute awareness of one's own mortality, and swapped out frequently as they cooled. No steaming plastic gadgets with cheerful blinking lights here, just blistering metal and the quiet satisfaction of flattening a hem like a champion. Then there was spring cleaning. Not a marketing phrase or a Pinterest trend. No, spring cleaning was a sacred institution. Windows removed from their frames, floors scrubbed with sand, furniture dragged ungracefully into the yard for a thorough flogging with wooden paddles, ceilings dusted with homemade feather contraptions designed to both clean and provide upper arm strength training. Even mattresses were aired out and thumped, not for health reasons, but to take revenge on the straw stuffing that had mysteriously settled into biased, uncomfortable lumps over the winter. All this labor wasn't only for aesthetics or hygiene. It was social armor. In a world where visitors might drop by unannounced and judge your morals based on the shine of your doorknob, housekeeping was a form of reputation management. Cleanliness was seen as godliness, but also as competency, virtue, sanity, and creditworthiness. And so, women adapted. They developed routines that rivaled military drill, passed on cleaning formulas like family heirlooms, and honed efficiency to acquired art. They knew the exact moment to throw out dishwater before freezing temperatures could turn it into icy sculpture. They double rinsed with rain barrel water for sparkle. They made their own soap, often from lard and lye, while giving surprisingly few nods of complaint to the fragrant absurdity of the process. Still, through all the scrubbing and drying and sweeping and folding, there remained a subtle grace, a rhythm to the work, a habitual dance that stitched together hours and seasons. There was pride in a well-whitened pillowcase, a meditative calm found in the swish-swish of a broom on a wooden floor, and sometimes, just sometimes, a pause in the middle of wiping down a windowsill to stare out at the world and think, perhaps, about nothing at all. So there they stood, sleeves rolled, forearms strong, surrounded by soap bubbles and the sweet drift of drying linens. A quiet army of women who didn't just survive household labor, they refined it into ceremony. And as the firelight flickers and another long day draws to its soft-edged end, perhaps we might wander next into the deepest fabric of 1800s domestic resistance, the secret sanctuary of the sewing circle. Sleep settled over the parlor like an expertly placed antimacassar. The embers in the cast iron stove murmured their final crackles, and our time meandering through the world of 19th century domestic grit comes to its last lantern-lit stretch. Tonight, we reach the quieter corners of everyday survival, the little graces and clever subversions that helped women press on through decades of wood smoke, damp linens, and the relentless clatter of iron pots. By now, the tools of the trade are familiar. Lye soap so caustic they could strip barnacles off a ship's hull, endless mounds of starch-stiffened shirts, and laundry manglers that looked suspiciously like instruments of mild medieval torture. But beneath the grime and grind was a surprising kind of wit, an unspoken language of coping strategies shared across kitchens, wash lines, and quilting bees. Take, for instance, the humble tea towel. Ostensibly a practical item for mopping up spills or hiding cooling pies from eager children, it became a low-tech communication tool. Embroidered messages, delicate coded stitching, carried sentiments no woman dared say aloud. "I yearn for rest," read one such stitch detail, cleverly worked into a row of tulips. Another noted, "Martha's husband still hasn't fixed the privy," which was either a joke or a public service announcement. Hard to say. The line between defiance and domestic duty grew blurrier with every thread. Community was its own kind of sustenance. While the history books celebrate presidents and inventors, it was the parlor visits, shared yeast starters, and whispered recipes for cough syrup that built enduring resilience. Women gathered for quilting circles, lured by the promise of stitching in the company of other tired minds. Folding together layers of fabric was as much about comfort as it was about insulation. In those silent stitches, many women found the kind of peace rarely afforded by their daily chores. And lest we forget, there was laughter. Wry, whispered laughter over cracked teacups during a well-earned sit. Jokes about husbands who couldn't churn butter to save their lives. Chuckles over children who managed to get sock buttons stuck up their noses. Even the household manuals, those dense, bossy tomes, became fodder for amusement. Imagine reading aloud, with great theatrical flair, a suggestion to air beds for precisely 17 minutes before sunrise on the first Tuesday of the high month, as if housework were an occult ritual requiring planetary alignment. Perhaps the most subversive act of all was rest. Not sleep exactly, though that was prized above rubies and boys who knew how to chop wood properly, but the act of becoming momentarily still. A quiet sit by a window, a finger slowly tracing the rim of a chipped plate, a sigh that lasted longer than it needed to. These small exhalations became a lifeline through the storm of soot and unrelenting expectations. Sometimes they wrote it down, their thoughts, heartaches, and clever strategies. Journals hidden in flower tins, letters never meant to be sent, recipes with side notes like, "Try this when you've got no eggs, no money, and no patience." These scribbles, often dismissed by dusty ledgers of real history, are tapestries of survival. And not just survival, but ingenuity shaped under pressure like porcelain in the kiln. And through it all, clothing offered both protection and peril. Corsets and long skirts were marketed as symbols of virtue and refinement, but tripping over your own petticoats while hauling a scuttle of coal was less than glamorous. Despite the dangers, Many women found ways to personalize their fashion. Lace cuffs stitched by candlelight, a hidden pocket sewn on the side for tucking away a scrap of chocolate, or a particularly irritating church bulletin. As the century turned and newfangled gadgets began to whisper promises of less labor, more leisure, many women looked skeptically at the hand pump or the coal-fired cook stove and murmured, "We'll see about that." And indeed, many of those labor-saving inventions simply shifted the work into different corners. But the old resilience held firm, quiet, diligent, and laced with humor as dry as November leaves. And now, dear listener, the candle gutters low. The tedium of household labor has folded itself away for the night, tucked beneath layers of ticking fabric and wood smoke-scented memory. Let your thoughts drift like steam from a kettle left to boil just a little too long. The house is quiet, the fire is warm, and out beyond the window panes, time itself seems to hum you to sleep. Sweet dreams, industrious dreamer. Your work is done.